This course is JavaScript syntax and operators. This module, all about the switch statement. The goals for this particular course are to learn the basics of JavaScript syntax and operators. We're going to talk about the switch statement. We'll talk about for in and for of loops, math, comparison, and logical operators, truthy and falsy, exception handling, data types, this keyword, and the spread operator. Let's get started. For this course, I assume you are a beginning JavaScript programmer and are familiar with the basics of HTML and CSS, but that you want to understand more about JavaScript syntax. If you're not familiar with JavaScript, there are some related Pluralsight courses you might take a look at. There's one called JavaScript Variables and Types and JavaScript Fundamentals. Maybe go watch those before continuing with this course. There are several modules in this course. This first one, all about the switch statement, will talk about simplifying multiple if-else statements, and we'll talk about block level scope issue and how to resolve that. The next module, the difference between for in and for of loops. So we'll talk about using the appropriate for loop for the appropriate condition, and we'll talk about break, continue, and labels. The next module, using math and comparison operators, where we'll do some demos of the different operators and talk about use strict. The next module, working with logical operators and short circuit evaluation. We'll talk about truthy and falsy and how short circuit evaluation works. The next module, utilizing JavaScript exception handling. We'll talk about try catch and finally blocks. The next module, how to determine JavaScript variable data types. We'll use the type of operator and the instance of operator to see how to determine what type of data you're working with within a variable. The next module is understanding this in JavaScript, where we'll talk about the use of this in different scopes and how it works within the call and the apply methods. We're also going to talk about the powerful spread operator. This helps you manipulate arrays and also pass arrays to functions. Now that you have an overview of the course, let's dive into our first topic, the switch statement. Now we use the switch instead of multiple if-else statements. It will help us simplify our code a little bit. We use case statements to compare to each expression in the switch statement. We use break statements to exit out of each case, and the default statement is used when none of the cases match. So here's an example. So I have a switch statement here that has some expression. We're then going to compare the value of that expression against each one of the case statements that we have. And you can have one or many case statements. We typically have quite a few. That's the reason why you would use a switch. Once a statement matches up, we'll execute a statement or a series of statements. You can have as many statements as you wish within each case statement. But very important is you have to have a break statement before the next case, because the break is what will then say continue with the line after the complete switch block. Now if no other cases match, then we use default. So if none of the other cases match up to the expression's value, then any of the statements within the default will execute. In this demo, we're going to take a look at a very simple switch statement, and we'll also take a look that this default statement that I talked about can actually be placed anywhere. It doesn't have to be at the bottom of the switch. I'm using Visual Studio Code, and I created an HTML document with a button, as you see on line 9, that in its on-click will call a function called simple switch that is already created on lines 11 through 13. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and declare a variable in here, like so, and I'm going to use this variable as the expression for my switch statement. So in the switch, I put in some expression. The expression just happens to be whatever this variable's value is. Now within the switch, we put our different case statements. So you can see I'm going to do a case 1. And I'm just going to simply spit out product 1 to the console. And then don't forget your break. Okay, we have to have the break because that's what separates each individual case statement. So we can do product 1, product 2, break, and then if none of those match, we can do a default. And on default, I'll just simply say unknown product, like so. So I save this HTML document, and what it's going to do is it's going to run this code. It's going to set product ID to a 2. It will look at the value of product ID and take the appropriate case statement. So let's go ahead and open up in our default browser. Let's bring up our F12 tools and click on the Switch Sample button. You can see down in the console we get product 2 showing up. Now if I go back and I change this to a 1, save this, go back to the browser, refresh, we now see product 1. And if I go back and change this to a 3, save, go back to the browser, refresh, we should now see unknown product. So there's a very simple little switch statement. One thing I did mention is that the default can be anywhere. It doesn't have to be at the end. You could put it at the beginning or anywhere. Kind of the more style that most people do is to put it at the end, but you can put it here. If we then go back to our browser, refresh, you can see we get the exact same result. One of the things you're allowed to do with switch statements is you're allowed to have multiple case statements. So what happens is if the expression that we're testing in our switch matches any of the cases, it'll fall through and execute the statement or the statements, and then we hit the break. So then it would break out of the switch. So this is perfectly legal, and we do this when we do want to match up an expression on many different types of cases. So let's take a look at multiple case statements, and let's also take a look at what happens when you forget a break. As you can see, I've added a new function here called multiple case, and I have a button then that will call this function. On line 13, we set a variable named color equal to the value red. On line 15 is where we're going to switch on that variable color. Now notice lines 16 and 17 where I do a case of red or a case of pink. I then call console.log, the color is red, and then I do the break. So what it does is it checks that color against both red and pink, and if either one of them match, it then drops into the line 18. You can then see a couple more cases where I've got a blue, a light blue, and a dark blue. And then we do the console.log, the color is blue, and then a break. Lines 25 and 26, we have case gray, and console.log, the color is gray, and then again a break. Let's go ahead and run this really quick so we can take a look. Bring up our F12 tools, and you can see that indeed we fall through to the correct place, which is the color is red. Let's now take a look at our second example, which is on this button click where we forget a break. We call this method here. So you can see on line 37, we create a product ID variable, set it equal to 2. The switch on line 39 is checking that expression. Now look at the case 1, that one's fine, as a console.log and then a break, but look at case 2 where we just have a console.log and we have forgotten the break statement. Then we have a case 3, notice what it is, console.log mountain bike socks, and then we break out of that. Now let's go ahead and run this and click on this. So what happens when you forget a break statement is it simply falls through to the next case. So even though it matched up on the case of product ID of 2, it still is going to, since there's no break, it's going to continue on with the next executable statements, which in this case happens to be the statements within the case 3, because that's where then the next break is. It then falls out of the switch. Now the switch statement does what's called a strict comparison. What that means is that the type and the value must match in order for the expression to match to one of the case statements. Let's take a look. We have a new function called strict comparison on line 11, and the button on line 9 actually calls that. You can see on line 12 I set a new variable, product ID, but look what I did. I set it to the value 2, but that's a string. Then within the switch statement, notice lines 15, 18, and 21 are a case of 1 numeric, 2 numeric, and 3 numeric. What do you think is going to happen if we were to run this code? We get unknown product because both the type and the value did not match any one of those case statements, because the value would have matched line 18, but the type doesn't match. As a result, none of the cases match the expression. It then falls into the default statement, which prints out unknown product. As you probably know, in JavaScript, as in C# and as in a lot of other languages, there can be a block, and a block is enclosed by the curly braces in these types of languages. So the switch statement is a block, but each case statement is not a block. If you want to make a block, you must make statements a block by wrapping them in braces. So the case statement can be wrapped within braces, and that would then make it a block. So why is that important? Well, let's take a look at a demo, and I'll show you the block level scope problem and a resolution to that problem. On line 12, I have a function called block scope problem. On line 13, I declare a variable, product ID, and assign it equal to 2. Now, take a look down in case number 1, where inside of there, I try to declare a variable called message. So let message equal to, and then this string value, and then I do a council.log on message. So then in case 2, I also declare a variable, let message equal to this string, council.log message. And then I do the same thing on line 25 within case 3, and on line 29 within the default. So as I mentioned before, the case statements themselves are not a block. So what would happen if we were trying to declare message in each one of these case statements? Let's open this up in our default browser. Let's hit F12 and look at this. We get immediately a message that says identifier message has already been declared. That's because each one of these is not a block, so it thinks that we're just declaring this variable over and over again, and of course, that's not allowed. So how do we fix this problem? It's actually very easy. Here you can see on each case statement, so case 1, I have added the brace and then a closing brace, and then I declare message inside of that brace. By making the braces, that creates a block. I then do the same thing for number 2, case 2, where I add an open brace and a closing brace, and then I declare the message within here. This is now legal syntax. Now each of these message variables are declared within a block, and then they are thrown away once the block ends. This is how you can fix the block level scope problem within a switch statement. In this module, we saw how the switch statement really helps us with our readability. It's also more efficient than using multiple if-else statements. The only thing we need to really kind of be careful of is with this block level scope, but I showed you an easy fix for that. Coming up in the next module, we're going to talk about using the appropriate for loop. We'll also talk about break, continue, and labels. I hope you'll join me for the next module.